Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing Game 4 of the Sharks-Blues Western Conference Finals, in which the Sharks lost 2-1. And so once again, the Sharks fail to actually take a bigger lead in a series. Every single time in these playoffs that they have led by even just a single game, they have then lost the next one. They were up 1-0 against the Golden Knights, lost Game 2, up 1-0, 2-1, and 3-2 against the Avalanche, lost every single next game, and now they've been up 1-0 and 2-1 against the Blues and have lost every single one. So the Sharks have shown little consistency in how they've been able to play from game to game in specific series, except back in games 5 to 7 against the Golden Knights, which was, all in all, a pretty long time ago. One thing the Sharks have shown consistency in is some of their pretty odd stats thus far through the playoffs. They've won every single game 1, they've lost every single game 2, they've lost every single game 4, and in games that are an odd number, so games 1, 3, 5, and 7, they have a record of 9-1, but in games 2, 4, and 6, they have a record of 1-7. So at least for the weird stats, the Sharks are showing some consistency, but for some reason, from one game to the next, the Sharks cannot play at similar levels. So this first period started off, and it was no surprise to anybody that the Blues would probably be the better team for at least the first half of the first period, just considering the fact that they were the home team tonight and considering how the last game ended. But what I was disappointed in the Sharks is that how easy they made it for the Blues to get this first goal of the game, which was Barbashev just 35 seconds in. The Sharks 3 prime opportunities to clear the zone from Couture, Meyer, and Burns, if I'm not mistaken. This would have prevented this goal, and so while the Blues goal ended up being lucky, it deflects, I believe, off of Nyquist and past Martin Jones, the Sharks could have been in a position to never have that lucky bounce even happen if they could just competently clear the zone, and it was pretty clear they were not ready to start this game, not ready for the pressure the Blues would exert right away. At least as the first period went on, it got a bit better for the Sharks. They got their decent amount of chances, but by the end of it, the Blues get a power play, and it's another deflection off of a Sharks player. This time it's Justin Braun, who basically kicks it into the net. Justin Braun now, 3 goals in the last 2 games have gone off of him from a Blues shot and into the net. He only had 2 actual goals in the regular season for the Sharks, so certainly unlucky for the Braun, and this last one looked like he almost intentionally kicked it into the net. Maybe too many hits to the head that have gone unpunished, that he's maybe forgot which team he is actually playing for. But we came into the second period, the Sharks were down 2 goals. We've seen multiple times in this series the Blues who were down 2-0 at the end of the first period. Just last game scored 4 goals in the second period. The last time the Blues were up 2-0, the Sharks managed to tie it up 2-2, although they did end up losing that game. And the second period, the Sharks were pushing heavily. The Blues weren't getting all too many chances, but the chances they were getting were quite good, and that it started to feel a lot like a game from last series against the Avalanche, where the Sharks were probably the better team overall, but you couldn't count out the Blues, who got multiple good chances when they could get them. And then the third period as well, Sharks continuing to have been the better team overall, but the Blues got their best, a couple of very good chances as well still, but it was Martin Jones who prevented the Blues from getting any more than 2 goals, and the Sharks eventually cut into the 2-0 lead with a hurdle power play goal. And while the chances continued for the Sharks, they actually had some very good pressure with the goalie pulled. It was not to be. The bounces did not go the Sharks' way as they did the Blues' way, and they end up losing this game 2-1 and head back to San Jose for Game 5 with a tied series at 2. First thing to talk about would be Martin Jones, who probably had his best game of the series. You could definitely argue maybe one of his best games of this series, but he was very, very good. Can't blame him for either of the goals as they go off of Nyquist and Justin Braun. The saves he had to make, he made. He made a couple of miraculous saves even against the Blues, and so he really kept the Sharks in this game. As I said, the Sharks were all around the better team, but that does not mean that the Blues did not have their fair share of chances, because the chances they did get ended up being very good and required Jones to make very big saves on them. So kudos goes to Martin Jones for keeping the Sharks alive for so long. Too bad they couldn't get more than a single goal in this game. Next is the second line that has just been so ineffective for the majority of this series. Actually, the entirety of this series, honestly, enough at even strength. And, the third line had its struggles a lot in a row. But the thing is that at least the third line, it's not that bad because it's the third line. But you take a look at who's on the second line for the Sharks. Tomas Hertl was potentially the regular season MVP for the Sharks. Joe Pavelski was their leading goal scorer, their captain. Evander Kane is a 30-goal scorer. And all three of them have just been so subpar in this series thus far. I mean, Pavelski had that 5-on-3 goal early on, but hasn't done much of anything at even strength. Same with Evander Kane. Hertl doesn't even have an even strength point yet this series. He did get the goal in this game, but that was on the power play. And so this second line definitely needs to step up because they were honestly the worst line of the game tonight, even worse than the fourth line, because I thought Donskoy, Goodrow, and Sorensen, at least for the time they were together, as that ended up being switched around a bit, actually got a couple of good chances. You could argue even better than the Kane, Hertl, and Pavelski line. So they definitely need to step up. The Sharks are still in this series. Of course, the series is only tied at 2, and if that second line can find a way to get going with how the third line has been playing recently, and with the fourth line playing pretty solid in the first line continuing to be rather consistent, the Sharks should be able to take this series, but they need some of their best players that find themselves on this struggling second line to actually step up and play well. Next is the power play for the Sharks. It did get a power play goal tonight, but I don't think anyone should really take pride in that. Similar to how I don't think the Blues should take pride in the fact that they've gotten 2 power play goals in these past 2 games, this Bozak one and yesterday's Perron one, because both of those went off of Sharks players, so it's not like this is some sort of insane power play comeback from the Blues. Same with the Sharks here. This is one Jordan Binnington should always have. This shot should never squeak through from Brent Burns, and yet somehow it does, which allows Hertl to put it in when it's behind him. That gets the Sharks the power play goal, but something clearly needs to change. It's not so much that the Sharks are playing this very poorly necessarily. It's not completely the fault of the Sharks. But we saw last series the Avalanche seemingly solved this Sharks power play system, and the Blues have basically just taken a page out of the Avalanche book and done the exact same thing here. And so credit must go to the Blues and the Avalanche for figuring out the Sharks system, but you have to criticize the Sharks for not trying to change anything here with how their power play works. Obviously in the playoffs, it's tough to make these changes on the fly. Maybe you're not practicing as much because of the fact that, especially for the Sharks who have gone to Game 7 in each of the first 2 series, it's basically game day, no game, game day, no game. So it's every other day you're playing. So it's tough to really get a practice in, tough to really try and make changes. But I think the prime example of this in this game is that the Sharks had a power play completely ineffective. And then later on in this game, they have a 4-on-4. So they have one less man on the ice than the power play. And yet they managed to control the zone a good minute and a half, moving the puck around. They even managed to change Couture and Hertl for Pavelski and Thornton and still maintained possession. They changed off Carlson and Burns for a couple other defensemen as well and continued to get good zone time, a couple of good chances. But for some reason, when they add the extra man, it's just completely ineffective. So don't let this power play goal fool you. The Sharks need to try and make some sort of changes. It's possible to sneak through this series without power play being effective if the Blues don't get lucky bounces on their power plays. But you'd really like to see the Sharks somehow be able to turn around, because even if the Sharks do win this series, they'll run into the Boston Bruins in the next series, who will probably just do the same exact thing, find just as easy success at shutting down the Sharks power play. And the Bruins have the best power play in the playoffs thus far. Well, I guess they're the only other team left here besides the Sharks and the Blues, but their power play is insane. So it's unlikely that it'll be a stalemate like it is in this series and like it was in the previous one as well. Finally, I'll talk about Erik Carlson, who had a bit of a scare in this game as he didn't play the last 7 or so minutes of this game up until, with about 2 minutes left, the Sharks put him on for that empty net chances, or the goalie pulled chances, and that could be a bit of a worry. We obviously have known that Carlson has been dealing with this sort of groin injury for the majority of these playoffs. At times he's looked a lot better. There's been a few games, let's say Game 6 and Game 7 against the Avalanche, that have been a lot worse. But it seemed as though he may have re-aggravated that in this situation, which is very bad for the San Jose Sharks, because Carlson is obviously a very key part. I saw it especially in this game, the fact that the Sharks are able to have one of Burns or Carlson on the ice for the majority of the game, at least from the second period onward, when Ryan starts to get less and less minutes, has been a huge benefit for the Sharks. And if Carlson ends up having to go on the sidelines and then Tim Heed will step in, no offense to Tim Heed, but he's not even close to the skill of Erik Karlsson, and it will be a huge loss for the Sharks. So hopefully this was maybe just end of the game thing. Maybe the fact that he got to play those last 2 minutes and didn't look terrible is a good sign going forward. I suspect he'll be in the lineup at the very least for Game 5, but hopefully he will be as effective as he has been for the majority of this series. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Sunday in the afternoon, surprisingly enough, even though it is in San Jose. So noon in San Jose is sort of a weird one to have as afternoon game. The Sharks have not been great in afternoon games during the regular season. I think they had just about an even record. It'll be a very key game. Of course, if the Sharks win, they'll have the 3-2 advantage, and it'll be a tough one going back to the St. Louis for Game 6. But if the Sharks lose, they're down 3-2 going back to St. Louis, meaning they have to win at that point. So it is certainly in the Sharks' best interest to get this Game 5 victory, as they did against the Avalanche in the previous series, and then they'll look to close it out in Game 6, as they could not do against the Avalanche in the previous series. Class dismissed.